Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. Contemplating Reality, Part 4. So first of all, kindly generate the attitude to study these teachings with the intention to put them into practice so that they may become a means for establishing all sentient beings in enlightenment. What we're studying here is not intended to make us philosophers. It's more so that we can begin to have some discerning with regards to some of the assumptions that we have with regards to our reality. And so we're giving it a hard look. We're taking a hard look at that snake. But it doesn't mean we come away being, proponents of the rope. It's just that we don't want to be fooled. So that's what we're doing here. And this, of course, will be ultimately further integrated through the practice of meditation. So what we're doing here with study is something that very often is referred to as establishing the view. So first, homage to the teachers of the author, Andy Karr. I pay homage to the ocean of Dharma. I pay homage to the ocean of ethics. I pay homage to the ocean of qualities and the oceans of compassionate ones who open the Dharma gate. So in the past now, we've looked at the first chapter, which was the identifying what we're doing here, which is looking at our hallucination, the issue of the snake, and that we operate with the vision that this delusion can be dispelled. Then we talked about the Buddha's approaches in presenting his teachings, the three turnings of the wheel, the four tenets. And then we have introduced the way of contemplation. Chapter 4 was about what we mean with selflessness. And also, I have uploaded a paper I mentioned also, which is coming from the field of mindfulness and wellness studies and so on. And it's the study of how the practice of selflessness and self-centering, how they operate in terms of identifying the happiness of people. So this is a contemporary academic paper, but it can be read in chunks. It operates from various angles, so please don't be intimidated by it. It's really worth reading. Then we looked at specifically the first of the what we call the four tenets, the Vibhashika, which is the analytical approach, looking at the objective matter in terms of particles and also in terms of understanding the notion of time. Then we have the Sutrantika, which is more about identifying what happens with the subject when we are perceiving things and where else do we stand in relation to the object. Are we actually seeing the object, or are we imposing our ideas? The way that we think of things, are they the actual things? Then we had the poetic interlude with the haiku. Then we last time looked at the radical nature of the Mahayana view and also its greatness, the possibility of abandoning any kind of objectification of any kind. And also in the basically relinquishing of nirvana, relinquishing the notion that the liberation lies in getting out. Rather, it's relinquishing the idea of self, and hence the natural manifestation of that such liberation is the compassionate activity for all sentient beings. And then we looked at the mind-only school and the role that this empty yet very vivid mind that we have, what it plays in terms of our lived experience. So that's what we've covered so far. Now we're going to look at the three natures. I'm reintroducing again this image that I made, and in understanding the three natures, which is basically part of the Chittamatra methodology, we understand in terms of how we see things. What are the thing itself? What is it that we're seeing? And could we see the thing without the confused seeing that we're operating with? So basically, it's like talking about the rope, and there we are hallucinating or misperceiving or mistaking the rope for a snake, and that's the imaginary nature, and actually just seeing it for what it is. That's the existent nature. So the place where we're starting is the imaginary nature, and that's then the white part of this this block. But it really just indicates it's a slider. So what we're saying here with the imaginary nature, this white section, is that gradually as it diminishes, the nature of reality emerges more and more. And that's then the perfectly existent nature. Now, what's particular about the Chittamatra is that this whole block, the whole thing, this mind, the dependent nature, that's seen to have a reality. And when it's seen properly, we could talk about some non-dual experience and so forth, but there would still be some notion of the pure consciousness and the pure non-duality, right? So that's where we'll see that the Madhyamika has a thing or two to say about that. But anyway, what we're doing here in terms of the path is we're starting over in the imaginary nature, which is how we operate, seeing snake. Then through the practice of the path, that gradually we are diminishing this, and eventually over at the perfectly enlightened existent nature, we have enlightenment. So that's what we're doing with the Chittamatra explanation of what's happening with us. And I think there's a lot of reason to say this is actually a very elegant, it's a very elegant model. Now, we'll look at each of these three natures. So the first is the appearances, and these are dependent on causes and effects. So within our reality, we operate with the fact that nothing happens randomly. Water boils when heated to 100 degrees, and we generally understand that things don't just happen randomly. They happen due to causes and effects, and also actions have results. So this is the dependent nature, or the paratantra, which means the other powered nature, that it's experienced on the basis of conditions. So as far as our experiences goes, then these appearances, they arise from the vasanas or patterns that are imprinted on the all ground or the all basis consciousness. So we looked at this last time, but that is how we are constructed. There's the basic ground, which is the all ground or the all basis consciousness. But on that basic unconsciousness, then there's, you could say, all our originality, our particularities as individuals. There are all these different vasanas, endless things that have happened to us in the past. They're imprinted there. We're imprinted with these vasanas, and then they emerge. And so we talk about habitual patterns. We talk about these sort of say hardwiring that's basic to us. So that's what creates our experience. Now, when we really understand what this dependent nature is, what the rope is, then we understand it for what it just naturally is, which is luminous knowing consciousness. And that's again this where the Chittamatra would assert this is something that is ultimately real. What is it again? The perfectly existent, perfectly established, is existent, perfectly existent nature. Yeah. So translators translate in different ways, yongdu, but perfected nature sometimes. Anyway, perfectly existent nature. And so that's what the dependent nature really is. So that's the essence of it. So that's through looking hard at this imaginary nature. We see through the imagination, we see the dependent nature for what it actually is. We see the rope. Did that really get in here? I apologize. That's embarrassing. That is so not what's supposed to be there. Hold on. See if I can just find the text for this. No. Yeah. So the next one is then the imaginary nature. Let me just check one thing though. Yeah. This is the mistake of dualistic delusion. And that's what we call the imaginary nature. Projection, basically. So the basis for this mistake is the dependent nature, our projecting onto it. So just like with the rope and the snake. There's nothing in here that you don't already know. Anyway. Now you can see how this works. Or not work. Come on. Good. Oh yeah. Thank you for your patience. Okay, there we have it. So, as you know, the mistake of dualistic delusion is known as the imaginary nature. Now, this is the one thing, though, that's important, that is not that obvious, that is that it's a naturally luminous disposition which is mistaken. So you could say that the projective quality is distorted. And so that's where this perception arises from. It's a distortion. And it's actually also, it's an important point that we understand, it's a diminishing. That's also what was implicit in that thing, that slider, which is that we first start off with something very bland. And samsara is very bland compared to nirvana. And so, sorry, we're not seeing the colors properly. And so what we're seeing is not just that you might think there's a beautiful, very interesting, passionate, tiger snake or something or other, right? And then you just end up with a sloppy old rope. You might think, oh, there's much more fun in samsara. That's not the case, actually. There's a misapprehension of things, but it's actually also diminishing. So we are reducing what is a naturally luminous disposition into then this anxious condition of self. So that is the experience then of the imaginary nature. So here then also Trungpa Rinpoche, he says this is then us. It's a bit like if we begin to think that the image in the mirror is real. Yeah? It's a very one or two-dimensional phenomenon, even though it looks like it has a lot more. Then there's the perfectly existent nature. And this is then, in fact, this is the dependent nature free of the imaginary nature. So like I said before, there's a natural luminous quality which has been distorted. That's what becomes manifest at the level of the perfectly existent nature. Now this is something which is not philosophy. Just like seeing it's a rope has nothing to do with philosophy. It's not that you're going to become a proponent of no snake or a proponent of rope. It's really just when the obscurations of various kinds they're eliminated. So this is something that is beyond the grasp of the concept of the conceptual mind, and this is the object of an undiluted subjectivity, an undiluted consciousness, which is then wisdom. We'll look more at that. Anyway, this wisdom is something that is, well, it's realized through, sometimes we talk about the three prajnas. First, hearing, reflecting, or contemplating, which is what we're doing now, and then meditation practice. So it's not something that we can just subscribe to. It needs to be experienced. Now, when we know this about the three natures, we can then engage in applying this, seeing this intuitively in terms of our everyday experience. So what we have that's imagined by names or thoughts and so on, all of this which is conjuring up perceptions and so on, that is the imaginary nature. So for example, if I meet somebody in the street, yeah, the person I'm meeting, that is in a way the dependent nature, but the way that I project onto this person, Mr. So-and-so, and then there's all the filtering that goes by on the basis of likes and dislikes, the emotional obscurations, and also basic duality, basic ignorance, not seeing the actual true nature properly. And that's then what is happening when we are meeting somebody or encountering any given object, really. So we could, however, and maybe if we're projecting onto a friend, the friend will say, hey, cut it out. You and your judgmental mind, Jakob, you're just projecting. And that's where the person is insisting on being seen for what he or she is. And that's actually on the assumption that we could see such a clarity, with such a clarity. So what is not imagined by names and thoughts, but appears due to causes and conditions, is the dependent nature. So just on the basis of that. The dependent nature's emptiness on the imaginary nature is the perfectly existent nature. It's the uncovered dependent nature. Now, again, applying this, it would mean that when something comes up, for example, we have an experience of suffering, that is happening, displeasure and so forth, various kinds, then that is the object itself, and that's the dependent nature. The experience and us then filtering, resenting and so forth, seeing this as something that we externalize and objectify and try to get rid of and so on. That's the imaginary nature. And then there's the emptiness of that. And this is then where we also have some perspective in the Vajrayana, where we speak about carrying all these various perceptions onto the path as great bliss. The absence of these projections, which then is the perfectly existent nature, makes for a very different experience than of whatever our perceptions might be. And this also applies then, for example, with anger. The display of the mind's natural capacity might arise in the form of anger, and then we project outwardly. We begin to see ourselves with fear and anxiety, depression, and then we begin to project outwardly paranoid, aggressive, and so on. And that's the imaginary nature. And in that we then, through practice and through insight, basically through just looking, seeing properly, then we're no longer caught by this projection, and then the anger is naturally liberated. This is the perfectly existent nature. Then again, in Vajrayana speak, we might say that the nature is purified as what it originally is before it's distorted, which is then mirror-like wisdom. So the various afflictions in the Vajrayana context, or also actually you also have this implicitly in the Mahayana, is then the notion that I think in the Yogacarya actually, if I'm remembering right, in the Yogacarya also, then one speaks about how these, when properly seen, then these the various kleshas are the five wisdoms. So thoughts are the luminous display of knowing, dependent nature. This is what arises. The dualistic objectification, the fixating and grasping, that's the imaginary nature. And the emptiness of the thoughts themselves, perfectly existent nature. And this is quite helpful to then integrate in terms of our practice. Jamgon Kongtrul Lodrotaya says, consequently, in the sutras, and this is an overview, and this is also really helpful in terms of us understanding the various teachings. In the sutras, teachings that list non-existence are presentations of imagined characteristics. So, for example, we might identify how we mistakenly are attached to objects that are not what they appear to be, and as a result, we suffer. So that's listing all the various confused projections. This is about understanding the imagined nature. Teachings on illusions, dreams, mirage, and so on, they're about the dependent characteristics, and that way, this is, for example, we have this also from Nagarjuna and others, where we would say, the 8 similes of illusion, that things they look like something, but they have nothing tangible about them. It's essentially understanding emptiness. And then the presentations of non-conceptuality and unconditioned teach them the consummate characteristic. So when we understand emptiness and we're no longer confused about the nature of reality, which is then understanding the Buddha nature, that's where we then let go even of the antidotes of the notion of even emptiness and just experience things fully for what they naturally are. So that's the consummate characteristic. Sorry, I didn't read Jamgon Kongtrul's without interjecting my own commentary, so I'm just going to read it. Consequently, in the sutras, teachings that list non-existence are presentations of imagined characteristics. Teachings on illusions, dreams, mirages, and the like are about the dependent characteristic. The presentations of non-conceptuality and the unconditioned teach the consummate characteristic. Okay. So now we're going to look at, and in here, Andy Karr presents then some contemplations that we're doing. They're quite extensive, so I'm really just, abbreviating them. So, yeah. So the first contemplation, non-existence. Yeah. So that's to take the imaginary nature on the path, meaning we're addressing the understanding that we have that we're projecting our reality and seeing that everything exists merely by imputation. So we want to look at our experiences, our thoughts, and we can look at the thoughts that are vivid, that really drive us and are, things that we're held by. Look at them. Can we actually find them? Can we touch them? There's something that appears, but actually, then again, what's the connection to the object that's perceived and so forth? That's where we understand that when we're thinking about something, and we also saw this in the Sutrantika, that these imagined objects, they are then non-existent. They're the imaginary nature. So what we can do and what Andy is suggesting is if we practice meditation like we would normally do in sort of the Mahamudra and Tsultrim traditions, when we practice shamatha vipassana, we just do settling meditation. We don't do analytical meditation. We don't do all these various methods that you have in other traditions. You simply just let the mind settle. And that's the basic approach then in terms of shamatha vipassana. And so that's where just letting the mind settle first, then we begin to introduce this contemplation. And that's then different. That's where we begin to look at the ways that we perceive things, that we think about the place we are, the people that are around us, objects. When we have thoughts about them, these thoughts and the object itself, are they are they related? And we can imagine the Eiffel Tower, or what is it again? One of the Sphinxes and the pyramids, and also I guess you can imagine your local Woolworths. But anyway, the point is, it exists in our mind, seems very real, but those thoughts, are they really that? And when we're in front of our Woolworths, what we're seeing is that are we actually touching the object? Anyway, there's a lot to be said about that, but the main point is more that we begin to be less caught up or obedient or submissive in terms of what arises in our mind. And Karr says, when you start to recognize the imaginary nature of these situations, they will start to lose their power over you. So this is a particularly important investigation. Usually we believe that we need to get rid of thoughts when we meditate. This is sort of the popular urban myth about meditation, right? That we're not going to have any thoughts and all of that, yeah? So we try to suppress them or cut them off. But it's much better to see that what we are thinking about is imaginary. And that's the Buddhist approach of vipassana, that we're just not deceived. So then we contemplate in terms of illusions, dreams, and mirages. And so first was more about the imaginary nature, now it's more about the dependent nature. So taking that on the path, we see that everything is merely consciousness. So we look at the thoughts, the mental images, and all their other phenomena. And when we do that, when we look at external objects, then we want to try to imagine how they exist without our projection, without our imposing or imputing our version of them, just the objects themselves. So that in terms of what we see, in terms of what we hear, also in terms of smelling, tasting, touching, and also with regards to thoughts themselves, like we've done earlier. Just understanding that thoughts themselves don't possess any intrinsic truth. So that's the way that we approach the dependent nature. And as for the non-conceptuality and the unconditioned, which is then the object of the sage, this is the object of wisdom. This is actually not that the object. The sage is not somebody sitting there thinking, "I've figured it all out," or "I have the answer." The sage is somebody who actually does not interfere with perceptions, with the world. And that's the beauty, and that's also what we're going to be looking at with, this is shared ground with Madhyamika, by the way. It's not classified like they do in Madhyamika, but there's a lot of overlap. And this, of course, also is why in the practice of meditation, we very often talk about non-meditation in the Mahamudra tradition, that we actually abandon the idea that we're going to hold on to some particular jhana or some particular meditation, some particular state. It's about opening up, seeing properly. So this is about letting go of our reactions, reflections, and so on. Actually, just looking properly. But here we're not looking at the perceiver or the object. We're simply just allowing our nature to settle. Andy Karr says, to connect with the perfectly existent nature, let go of any idea about what is, including the idea that everything is merely consciousness. There is really no technique or method for letting go into non-conceptuality and the unconditioned. Any technique would be artificial. And that's also implied then in the Mahamudra term non-meditation. And of course, it's implicit also in Dzogchen, and it is actually implicit in all of Vipassana. But at this point, it really is emphasized what the objective of wisdom is that we're actually not introducing anything additional. We're really just taking away the shades. The way to practice this is to realize that whenever there is a little break in the flow of conceptuality, the perfectly existent nature is there. We cannot fabricate it, and we don't need to fabricate it. Just let the experience of the perfectly existent nature come and go. Holding on to it is also a superimposition, so just let it come and go. This also is intrinsic to meditation instruction. There might be some moments where there's more clarity, less confusion. But the last thing we want to do is to begin to hanker or wish to repeat these experiences. So this was about the three natures. I should remind you, if you have any questions or comments or uncertainties, please don't hesitate to voice them. Write the questions. Okay. Whoa. Okay. All right. If the emptiness of the dependent nature of the imaginary nature is the perfectly existent nature, yes. What about the emptiness of the dependent nature of its appearing characteristics? For example, the form of the rope or the presence of the thoughts. Okay. What we're talking about there is, and this we're going to look at now in the next chapter, is that form is emptiness and emptiness is no other than form. So when we're looking at the rope, we're looking at the emptiness of the snake, but it doesn't mean that what was there goes away. So when we say emptiness, that is really just the nature of the dependent nature, but the nature of the dependent nature is also appearances. So we talk about the unity of appearance and emptiness. And we'll have this famous quote from the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, right? So these two, appearance and emptiness, they existed as a unit. Okay, that was the first question. These aspects of the dependent nature are not non-dual or non-conceptual or unconditioned. So it doesn't seem to fit with Control's definitions of the thoroughly established nature. Well, it's more that the nature of the mind manifests as all the objects and so forth. So if we see them properly, then, I mean, this world is not going to go away, right? We're going to see it properly when we take away our shades, right? So in that sense, the subject, this unconditioned or the lack of confusion, that nature enables us to see then everything, both in terms of subject and object, properly. So they are by themselves. They possess they are the enlightened display. Again, it's referred to as the luminous mind. I think that's several times this comes up. Control's definition of the three. Are Control's definitions of the three nature a bit more developed than the traditional definitions? No. All the various pretty much all the traditions always are pretty consistent in terms of these things. They're found in the scriptures, let's say, of the five dharmas of Maitreya. So the traditions they might somehow differ in the way that they extract their meaning from them and so on, but pretty much they would be the same thing. Yeah. Okay. The eight consciousnesses. the dependent nature. No, they're actually, well, that's a good question. They would, in the ordinary aspect, okay, I'm just gonna, yes, in the ordinary aspect, the ground of them is the dependent nature, but they're misconstrued, so the eight consciousnesses become perverted into the ordinary eight consciousness of a sentient beings. But you could say the nature of the ground, or what's the basis for the eight consciousnesses, that is the original, how do you say, the dependent nature. So for example, the alaya, right, which is the first, which is then in its pure nature is the Dharmakaya. The afflicted nature is the arising of wisdom and compassion. And all the display then of the various consciousnesses would naturally also just be the display of what we call kayas and wisdoms. So in and of themselves, all phenomena are the dependent nature. That's the Yogacarya position. So we can either distort or we can see properly, but no phenomena go away. The eight consciousnesses are normally understood as the disposition of a confused sentient being. So they would belong to, in their distorted being, the eight consciousnesses, they would then fall in under the imaginary nature, but the ground of them is then the dependent nature. So, chapter 10, the middle, which is all about then Madhyamika, the middle view, the middle way. Now, this historically, this comes from these are the Buddha's teachings, but it said that they were given given to the Nagas to preserve, and they were then later extracted. Basically, like in the Nyingma tradition, you have these things called treasure teachings. Nagarjuna received this from the Nagas, which had these teachings where they were custodians of them, and despite that highly unusual origin, what we find in the Prajnaparamita teachings, that then is what Nagarjuna received, teachings on emptiness, is consistent with what we have in what the general Buddhist teachings, but it's more elaborated, and we do then have Nagarjuna's shastras, or commentaries. And this teaching on the Prajnaparamita is something that is it's practiced, or it's accepted as valid Buddhist teaching all across the Mahayana, so in Korea, Vietnam, Japan, China, and so forth. And this is really the key teachings that are referred to, and that establishes the view of emptiness. Of course, we have them implicitly elsewhere in all the Buddha's teachings, but particularly then in view that there was misconception of some of these teachings, as we have it in the Sutrantika, that assert some absolute value to certain objects and so on. Then the Prajnaparamita really served to consolidate or clarify what the Buddha meant in terms of the absolute nature of reality. When we say emptiness, it means that we're no longer imposing our confused, we could say innate belief in a self and so forth, and also not those we have acquired through education and so forth. And these various strategies or reactionary patterns, dogmas if you like, that misconstrue and misunderstand reality, we refer to them as extremes. It really just is a way of thinking, oh, if it's not this way, then it must be another. You know, one of my friends was traveling in South India, and I guess it must have been in a place where he was just a tourist, but he was going through a place where I guess there must have been some Germans working there. And somebody came up to him and asked, "Are you a tourist or are you German?" And, you know, you can understand people. they see various kinds of, but this guy actually, he was working, so he was neither of these categories, but that's what we do. We'll look at that, and this is very much the thrust of the, what we call Madhyamika reasoning, is really just trying to get out of our assumptions about things. So the Prajnaparamita teaching is studied widely, and also when we come to Tibetan Buddhism, then this is really the view all across the various traditions. Everybody subscribes to the middle way view of Nagarjuna. So, as per what was, we just had a question about, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness is no other than form. So in the perception of form, that's where we find emptiness, and we would never have an emptiness where there's no form. Emptiness is the absence of solidity, but it doesn't mean there's no appearances. So it doesn't mean anything goes away. It just means seeing clearly. Form is no other than emptiness. We're not going to find an emptiness other than the computer screen, the room we're in, and ourselves. And emptiness is no other than form. Emptiness is nothing else beside these phenomena. And Karr says, Nagarjuna demonstrates that everything that appears is without true nature. While it appears, it is empty. While it is empty, it appears. There's no contradiction. As Tsongsa Rinpoche says, then the reason why we wander in samsara is when we divorce appearance and emptiness. So we have the most well-known work from Nagarjuna, and it's a shastra, it's a script that he wrote that brings home the view of emptiness, or the view that nothing can be objectified. And in here, this is then called the Mula Madhyamika Karika, and it's translated. There's several translations. One is Fundamental Wisdom. I should give you a list of what translations there are, actually. There's one by J. Garfield, there's actually quite a few. There's one by what's his face? Stephen Batchelor. I think there's also one, and with commentary by Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, probably Ari Goldfield. But it's a very important, and of course also, yes, Padmakara has also translated it. It's very important. It's not easy reading. And if you want a philosophical treatment of it, then you have J. Garfield's Wisdom, the Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, or something like that. Anyway, in here then, Nagarjuna says, existence is the view of permanence. Non-existence is the view of extinction. Therefore, the wise do not abide either in existence or non-existence. So we label phenomena, and we give them some labels that really just is based on our projection. And that's where we solidify things into either they're there or they're not there, and so on. And it actually misses the point about the actual existence of the phenomena itself. So if we are saying it exists, we're missing the point. If we're saying it doesn't exist, we're also missing the point. So Nagarjuna's point is that anytime we label conceptually, we're really just looking at our own projections, and we're missing the point. So that happens on a basic level of ignorance, but then also with philosophy in particular. That's where we want to pigeonhole phenomena. And so, again, that's where Nagarjuna is tough reading, because he doesn't make any philosophy up, but he shows the shortcomings of philosophy. The King of Samadhi Sutra, existence and non-existence are both extremes. Pure and impure are the same, and pure and impure here means seeing properly or seeing improperly. These are just relative constructs. Therefore, abandoning all extremes, the wise do not even abide in the middle. As we'll see, Nagarjuna does not want to create a new and improved philosophy. And what he just wants to do is really exposing the flaws of philosophy altogether. In the Western world, we have similarly in the 20th century, we have the philosophers in the US like Richard Rorty, who had a philosophy which was about sort of anti-foundationalism, where he would say the philosophical project of truth doesn't hold because truth is so dependent on who constructs it. And in France, we had Jacques Derrida, who, with this deconstruction of logocentrism, he proved that also what we assert as truth is only really a construction according to our optics of something that's true in relation to untrue. And so the idea of something being higher and something being inferior, better and worse, so on, is entirely constructs. So unfortunately, what happens with that is then it becomes a very nihilist view and where there's no real truth whatsoever. Richard Rorty has something called pragmatism, and I'm not really too familiar with what that is, but we do see my sort of gripe with this is that overall in our world there's very much a nihilist view that that asserts that there is no meaning whatsoever with our existence, which is really, really hugely problematic, you know. So this is of course another and a very great discussion, but we'd also want to see how what we're looking at here really has relevance for the world that we are lived in. So when you read Nagarjuna's deconstruction or critiques of philosophies, it's very much directed towards Indian philosophies. And of course, these Indian philosophies, they're archetypal in the sense that they're the same thing that applies in terms of Western philosophy. It's universal themes, but sometimes it can be a little bit dense reading, just especially also if we study Chandrakirti and the introduction to the middle ways. Some of these, the presentation of what we call the objects of refutation can be pretty inaccessible. So that's why it's important that we understand the overall concept, which is that we're trying to lift ourselves out of this project of saying this is how it is. Anyway, we'll look at the methodology now, and I think the illustration that Andy had is quite good, because we'll look at something and say, oh, it's small. And then we'll look at something right next to it and say, oh, we'll look at this one here and say, oh, yeah, I mean, it's small. This is small compared to that. And so then we think, well, this is big. If only I had this. Or that is big. Now, it's not just about size as such, but it's more that we attribute solid labels onto them. And then when we come across this one here, then the same one, then we compare it to this, and then again, that is small. This is kind of self-explanatory. We also see it here in terms of these two chaps who are arguing. See, one says it's 6 and the other says it's 9. Now, we'd like to establish that the absence of 9 or 6ness, that is Nagarjuna's point. And we would also like to respect either gentleman who is actually right. From one point of view, there is a 9, from the other, there is a 6, and that's why we call it relative truth. But we also say the Tibetan word for relative truth is kunso, which means it's something that veils. It means veiling everything. We're not seeing clearly. And so when we're seeing things with our particular optics, seeing it from the left side of the room or the right side of the room, we think we're seeing things for what they are. And that's where we then begin to have, like these two, they're arguing, and all of a sudden they'll be throwing bombs at each other, because one represents the true way of doing things according to, the way of the 9, and the other will insist, no, that's the wrong way. It's the truth is according to 6. Can't you see? And so we have this. This is something that is reflected in every time we watch the evening news, and it's something that's reflected in our entire perception and the way that we solidify things. We have then this quote from the sutras, which says, Katayana, the Buddha speaking, Katayana, most people in the world fixate intensely on things as being existent, and others on the thought that things are non-existent. As a result of their clinging, they're not free from birth, aging, sickness or death, from agony, crying, suffering, and mental anguish or agitation. Especially, they're not free in any way from the torments of death. So, this imputing existence or non-existence or both or neither and so on is about what we call extremes. That's pigeonholing reality. And Karr says, clinging to existence and non-existence is at the heart of our suffering. To free ourselves from suffering, we need to free ourselves then from clinging to existence and non-existence. Now, we can think about this, and there's a lot written about it, and the Madhyamaka teaching famously operates with a very elaborate, but also not just elaborate on the basis of just going on and on, but just very intelligent and highly precise logic. So initially when we come across that, sometimes we might be philosophers in the sense that we just like to sort of sit and share ideas and so on, but this operates with logic, and it's like as uncompromising as math. But we might want to consider it because this kind of application of reasoning, it enables us to gain certainty in the view. That's where we begin to see. Yes, we might not like it, but 4 plus 4 is 8. And then it's not as if we can sort of say, I'd really like it to be 7. I'd really like it to be 9. There's not much to do. And so there's a hard intelligence that has to be acknowledged. Otherwise, I'm always quoting Tsontsekens Rinpoche, who would refer to this more romantic or inspired approach to the path as inspiration disease. And that's where we feel spiritual, and we feel the force, and we feel inspired and so on. And of course that's very good, but there has to be a place where we're really looking through confusion and understanding what drives it, and that's where we'd want to do this at all times, regardless. And so even on a rainy day, the sort of 2 plus 2, 4 plus 4, and so on applies. So Andy Karr says, having an opinion that things are empty, or a general understanding of emptiness, isn't going to do much good. So we might have sort of a feeling of emptiness, or just, I'd like to think everything is empty, so on. That doesn't really help much. And so I am meditating. It says, okay, out of great emptiness arises compassion. Oh, yeah, we have to be clear on what we're talking about. And Andy Karr says, we already believe there are so many reasons that things exist. Each of these reasons need to be refuted so we can develop confidence in emptiness. And that's also really a valid point. And that's why there's a lot of reasonings that apply in different ways. Actually, today we won't do that chapter, which is called the Great Arguments of the Middle Way. We'll have to do that next time. Otherwise, it'll just be a bit too much. So when we looked at that image, right, of that we can see there's no ultimate small or big, and likewise also it's no 6 or 9. That's something we can understand. Now that's called appropriate ultimate. But to realize it, to be completely free of that, is really the scope of a sage, and that's actual ultimate. This is also sometimes referred to as categorized or uncategorized ultimates. And I'm interjecting this here. It's not actually in the text, but we're going to revisit it, and it's important actually that we begin to understand. So when we're talking about emptiness, sometimes you can hear a little bit of a confused notion that, we can't talk about non-duality, or we can't talk about emptiness because it's just beyond. No, we can use our rationality, and our certainty in the view of emptiness is something that provides an understanding of the absolute. So that's where we can understand that things yes, we can look at that 6 and 9. We can look at the short and long, and that can give us a very clear understanding of how we're mistaken. We're not realized. It's also like in the movies. We might see it's a movie, and then for a moment we're sort of like, okay, but then it comes back. So we can have what's called an approximation of the ultimate. That's not realization, but that is something that really gives us certainty in the view. And so this understanding is valuable. And so the object of this understanding is then an ultimate. It's not the realized ultimate, it's what we call an approximate ultimate or categorized ultimate. Jakob, get a grip. It's conceptualized. It's a conceptualized ultimate. Okay. And so that's the categorized. And then the realization of this, the object of wisdom which is beyond concepts, language, or expression, and which is the scope of an undiluted realization, that is then called the actual ultimate or uncategorized absolute. We'll be looking more at that. So in this quote that Andy Karr has from Jamgon Mipam, from The Adornment of the Middle Way, then in it we'll find a line that says, if one engages in this path, which establishes through valid reasoning the meaning of the Buddha's words, pure in terms of the three knowledge sources, one will gain an extraordinary conviction in the unmistaken view, meditation, and practice. Now, what we call the three knowledge sources is, like we've seen earlier, direct observation. And that's what we also in science would call empirical observation. So that's seeing a fire. Inference is then a valid understanding that's based on not seeing directly but inferring, like there is a fire, we can't see it, but we can see smoke rising up over the trees. And then we can also rely on scriptural authority, someone that we trust. We might not have been there when the moon landing happened, but we trust the sources, or we might have heard about that some things happened, and we trust those that describe it, or we also trust when we hear about somebody describing a country they went to, and so on. So in the Buddhist context, we also then rely on what the Buddha has to say. And of course, we put it to the test. We're encouraged to put it to the test. But we start off with this. We start off with this giving it the benefit of the doubt. And also, I think I mentioned before, when we do see something, and then we see that the Buddha also said it, then it lends some weight to it. Also, in the quote, it says, faith will be gained through knowledge, and thanks to this, no adversary or negative force will be able to divert one from the path. Because we could very often, when the disease, what's it called, inspiration disease wears off, or we're no longer in love with the guru, or we're kind of over this, and then if we haven't actually had this thorough sort of establishment of the valid nature of the truth, let's say of emptiness or whatever, if we haven't had it, then it's very easy to sort of just go for something else. But if we know that this is undeniably a fact, then nobody's going to tell us otherwise. So coming back to the mind only about the non-dual nature, with the Madhyamika analysis, even the mind, as in the mind-only dependent nature, is refuted. In the sense, not that we're saying it's not there, but we're saying this nature doesn't have absolute value in and of itself. So we're saying the mind. We're not actually denying the phenomena as such. We're not denying the imaginary nature as such. We're not denying the perfectly existent nature as such. But we're just saying that none of it can resist what we call absolute analysis. Nothing stands up and is something that is not seen as being just a dependent arising. So we might assert the reality of an indescribable non-dual mind, which we do in the mind-only tradition. Yet, Madhyamika would refute all views, including even this view. There's nothing to hold on to there. Basically, we're talking about the experience that if there's a realization, then to hold on to that, to go into samadhi based on some notion of, let's say, even non-existence or no reference whatsoever. If there's still some dwelling on it, then this is still the cause of returning into delusion. So the difference between Chittamatra and the Madhyamika is very subtle, and as a result, they are also very similar in the way that the practitioners practice. Even some of the siddhas were actually Chittamatrans. Settling in the nature of mind, you've heard that somewhere, right? Then that sounds like the right thing to do. It's good to have the Madhyamika perspective that it's something that cannot be grasped. But then again, you might settle into the mind and you might not grasp. So it's a little bit, it's subtle, but it's certainly important when we establish the view that we understand this, that there's nothing that we can objectify. So then we had very important debate here. I don't know if any of you found it on YouTube, but it's up there. And yes. Actually, I have to say I like Andy's book here. It has certain quirky aspects. So the host, Miss Elk, Anne, you have a new theory about the Brontosaurus. Elk. Could I just say, Chris, for one moment, that I have a new theory about the Brontosaurus? Exactly. What is it? Where? And so on. So I assume you've all read this, so I'll spare you for my rendition of it. But this is obviously about the tediousness of views taken to the absolute extreme, and the sort of the obsession around the views, my theory and all of that. And also in terms of refuting the view, also what Andy very how to say insightfully brings home. This is one way of refuting the view. We're not sure about exactly if that's the way that you'd want to refute the wrong view. Anyway, so chapter 11, Svatantrikas and Prasangikas. So with the Madhyamika, we're talking about this middle way, the non-abiding. And then we actually have a term, freedom from conceptual constructs. So sometimes we talk about freedom from elaborations or conceptual elaboration. Nishprapancha or trudra, which means the absence of these concepts that cloud us, the dualistic concepts. So that is what is the object of realization. That's what the middle way is about. So we should understand that we have the absolute Madhyamika, the Dharmadhatu, the nature of reality, which is the nature of absolute realization. And that we call the real Madhyamika, if you like, Dönki Uma, or the absolute Madhyamika. Then we have the relative Madhyamika, and that's what we are looking at here, which is the teachings as such, the teachings on Madhyamika. And that literally in Tibetan, Tsikyuma really just means the Madhyamika of words. So one is the Madhyamika of reality, or absolute Madhyamika. The other is the word Madhyamika, the relative Madhyamika, the teachings. Now, there's a lot of there's a lot of discussion, as some of you might know, in Tibet about this, and they can kind of become a little bit, let's say, tedious again, but in some way, it's also a tradition of actually being quite sharp in terms of applying your reasoning. So in one way, even though the Tibetans were a monoculture, and they could very well all have sat down and just happily agreed, and possibly they could all have just meditated, and that some might say that would probably be a better idea. Then, nevertheless, there was a certain culture um, of debate which became quite prevalent, and there was quite a few and very sophisticated views on what actually this means. So we do talk about various debates, and actually I put up in the folder an extract from a work on the Prasangika and Svatantrika debates. It's a chapter which highlights Mipam Rinpoche's presentation of the Prasangika, but it's very interesting, and it reflects the general debates. And in some way, Mipam Rinpoche's what he brought to the table, contribution, is very much coming from this Rime or non-sectarian perspective that really goes beyond some of the dichotomies that we have in some of the debates. But I think you'll find it interesting reading if you read that sort of stuff. So it's sitting up there. It's by George Dreyfus, who's really a giant in terms of Tibetan scholarship, Madhyamika, and also Pramana scholarship. And he's written a piece called "Will the True Madhyamika Stand Up?" Is it? I think it's actually maybe the Prasangika, actually. May the true Prasangika stand up. Anyway, so of course, what we want to understand is basic also to Madhyamika is that saying I am the right, I am the right Madhyamika is exactly what we don't want. We don't want, Madhyamika is supposed to eliminate the confused fixating on a self. So it's actually completely contradictory to the Madhyamika spirit that we have these kind of divisions. But again, they can really be quite helpful in terms of bringing home very clear reasons in terms of understanding. Not gaining knowledge, but more in order to not be tripped up or sidetracked or seduced by flawed logic. Because it's everywhere. It's basic to our whole nature of our cultures, really, all these confused statements about reality. So when we're studying the teachings on emptiness, we can study them from the point of view of emptiness, and then from the point of view of the wisdom. One is more on the objective side, the lack of inherent existence and so on. It's more to do with the second turning of the wheel, the teachings on the Prajna Paramita and so on, establishing essentially an ontological perspective of emptiness. And the other is the wisdom, the subject that realizes this. And that has more to do then with the epistemic dimension of non-confused understanding. So we could say the object is wisdom and the object is emptiness and the wisdom is the subject. So for that reason also when we study this, approach this, we very often start off with the Madhyamika understanding, and only later do we come into the teachings on Buddha nature. If we started off with the teachings on Buddha nature, then there's a risk that we could take Buddha nature to be something that we fixate on. So this we see again and again, that in terms of the methodology of presenting these two, but we would say they are essentially complementary. Now, in Tibet, we have two famous traditions of Madhyamika, two approaches. One is we call Rangtong, and they would say, well, all phenomena are intrinsically empty, and they emphasize then the emptiness aspect. But we would also say that those who would say, well, phenomena, they're empty, but only of confused projections. They're not empty of themselves. And as you can hear, this is more aligned with a Yogacarya perspective. But they would still say they're Madhyamika, but their emphasis is more than on the aspect of wisdom and the luminosity. And they would say then, this luminosity, this is the great middle way. So they would say the Rangtong, that's a general middle way, and then we would say the Shentong is a great middle way, and so on. sometimes there was a little bit of squabbling happening around this, and so on. Anyway, presently we're going to look at the Rangtong, and this is then the view that does not take anything as absolutely existing, not even the luminosity, if you like. So this is consistent also with the teachings on Buddha nature and so on. But in there we have two approaches. Now this is different here. One is the Svatantrika and Prasangika. Svatantrika is more user-friendly. Prasangika is more absolute, and it's generally the sort of the regal one. It's the final word. But Svatantrika is quite helpful, and we'll look at this. So when we approach the understanding of emptiness, we can apply three stages. One is the unanalyzed reality, and this is what we sometimes would refer to as the shepherd's perspective. And it's just, that's how nobody thinks about things. They're just what they are, you know? That it's when we don't analyze things. It's just ordinary worldly, or, you know, unanalyzed reality. We all operate with that, you know? We don't think too much. It's, you know, there it is. Things are just here. But then we apply, and this is interesting, we call this a slight analysis, and that's leading to the intellectual understanding of non-existence. And that's what we're doing here, right? We're taking things apart in the Vibhashika, the Sutrantika, the Chittamatra, and particularly also here. We're essentially establishing, this perception of things as the way that I see it, my relative construction of phenomena, actually doesn't apply. And that's where we intellectually then analyze, we arrive at a place that we call the approximate absolute. And this is slight analysis from the point of view that it's analysis, but it hasn't taken, you could say, wisdom to its full potential. It's still sometimes also synonymous with what we call absolute analysis, which is the same thing. We're just seeing that nothing inherently exists. But there's another dimension to this, and this has again to do what we looked at before, right? Which is about either you can understand it intellectually and you can also realize it. So then we have thorough analysis leading to realization beyond concepts and the actual ultimate. That is then through the practice of the path. So that's a much greater. That's again the difference between the slight analysis is the scope of somebody on the path, understanding this, appropriating it, integrating it, but then thorough analysis is then when it's actually felt and realized. Yeah. Just see if there's some questions here at this point. Is basic duality of subject and object before characteristics of either the imaginary or dependent nature according to Chittamatra? I better say it's the imagined. It's the imagined. That's the imaginary nature. We impose on the existence of things a duality which is actually not there. That's the imagined nature, yeah. The nature of reality, which would be complete with the windows, the walls, the computer, you know, everything. The dependent nature, complete with all of that, can be experienced without that duality. Yeah, so that's where we would then we'd see the dependent nature for what it is. Yeah. I hope that answered that. So, again, in terms of these three stages of analysis, then Nagarjuna, he says about thorough analysis, he says, unknowable by analogy, peace, not of the fabric of fabrications, non-conceptual, free of distinctions. These are the characteristics of the precise nature. So this is the realization of the freedom from conceptual constructs. And this is not something that is known by language or by thought and so forth. Shantideva then famously in the Way of the Bodhisattva in the 9th chapter says, also in thorough analysis, it says the absolute is not within the reach of the intellect, for intellect is grounded in the relative. By the way, this 9th chapter where this is quoted from will be taught, but we have a great Khenpo, and some of you would probably have received a mail about it, who's going to be coming and teaching in end of May, beginning of June, in Sydney and also up in the Northern Rivers, New South Wales. And in Sydney, then he will be teaching the Heart Sutra, which we quoted from, and up here north, he will be teaching then the Wisdom chapter. So just set aside those dates if you wish to go more thoroughly into this, particularly actually the Wisdom chapter of both of them really. And also this is a very qualified Khenpo, not only very learned, but also somebody who speaks English and is extremely learned. So this is really an opportunity to get this not just as contemplation, but as we can thoroughly hear it and also ask questions to somebody who would really be able to draw on an incredible wealth of knowledge of the Buddhist teaching. So the Svatantrika, operates then with this gradual path, with approximate and actual reality. So the Svatantrika accommodates this understanding that first you sort of get an understanding of the non-existence of phenomena, and then that translates into a complete realization, which goes beyond the concepts. And so that's where the Svatantrika, the way that it understands the path, is more gradual. The Prasangika, and this also is reflected in the reasoning of the Prasangika, is much more a sudden path of non-conceptuality. The Prasangikas, they operate with just exposing the flaws of the logic. So, for example, if somebody with a 6 and 9 that the two gentlemen were arguing over, then the Prasangika would say, well, if it really is 9 according to you, then everybody in the world, it follows that everybody in the world sees it as 9. And that's where the Svatantrika, they would be more what we would call, they would make assertions. They would more explain it in terms of, well, here we have a 9 which can be seen from both sides and so on, and explain more, making more assertive argumentation. So in a way, it's more engaging. Prasangika, it's but it also exposes the flaw much more vividly. What is significant then with these Svatantrika is that we have somebody like Shantarakshita who, in promoting this Svatantrika, not that he wasn't a Prasangika also, but he, in terms of presenting the Mahayana, he united the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka in his Svatantrika approach, where basically he would explain the Chittamatra, he would explain relative truth according to Chittamatra, and he would explain absolute truth in terms of explain the absolute truth in terms of the Svatantrika. But ultimately, there would be no difference between the Prasangika and the Svatantrika approach of the absolute. The methods would be slightly different, but it's not as if there would be any difference in the absolute nature that they realize. So in this way, the Svatantrika accommodates more this more gradual. More. Now this was initially brought to Tibet in the 8th century, really, and there were commentaries. There's a commentary by some of these, I think it's Gyaltsabje or Kedrubje, Tsongkhapa's students and a few others. But it wasn't really until the 19th century that Mipa Rinpoche then really, at the request of Jang Khenpo Wangpo, he wrote some commentaries on the sutra tradition according to the Nyingma view, and that's where he then really reestablished the teaching practice of this particular approach. And so there are strong reasons for the Svatantrika approach, really, like I just said. There is this gradual approach with the approximate and ultimate, the approximate and actual reality. That's the Svatantrika or autonomy school. And where the Prasangika or the consequent school is more operates with the thorough analysis beyond concepts. So it's really just, more sharp. There's a quote in here from Mipa Rinpoche, which is quite important. And his point is that as much as the Prasangika approach is really important, he says there is also danger with it. And that is that you could be too intellectual about it. And so you basically would arrive at an understanding of emptiness, but it would really just be an idea. And so if you just hold that as that idea, then you are no better off than anybody holding any other extreme view. It becomes a substance, a ngupo, like he says. But then there's also the other view then, which is then without really having understood it, you just leave everything in a void sort of sense of dull, like, oh yeah, emptiness, just not asserting anything, but at the same time not really having the sharpness of insight. It's not freeing up insight. It's actually just having a dull over gloss, a gloss of dullness. And again, same thing. So he says there's some value in this gradual approach. So Andy Karr, he then says, these are the So we have these two. The Svatantrikas, the Svatantrika have two schools then. Okay, this is okay. This is like anything. Sometimes you get a lot of information, but anyway, it's not that difficult. So in terms of the Svatantrika, right, the way that they explain relative truth. So basically, the Prasangika, they sort of avoid the whole problem. Actually, we'll see. But then we're explaining relative truth. We have two kinds of the Svatantrikas. Yeah, they are those which follow the Svatantrika approach, and that's then the Svatantrika Svatantrika Madhyamika, and then they also assert they assert the existence of particles and time. And this is what, for example, somebody like Bhaviveka, he has subscribed to this. And then we have those who follow the Yogacaryan model, which is then that everything is mind, the three natures and so on. So even though you very often have in Tibet that people are Madhyamikans and so on, there's a lot of sort of people they like the Yogacarya a lot. And also us in the modern world, the Yogacarya is quite a helpful way of understanding our relative reality. So that's the Svatantrika. And then we have, and this is about understanding then the world around the relative truth, right? Now the Prasangika, they actually don't try to philosophize ordinary appearances. And this is pretty cool also. They would say, well, we just do whatever the people of the world do. If you ask a shepherd, where do you come from? So this is very often refers to, the shepherd is very often becomes sort of the proverbial embodiment of just somebody who just subscribes to it. Who just lives life without asking questions. And so if you ask the shepherd, where do you come from? The shepherd's not going to go into some philosophical view about the sort of the higher cosmic role he's playing, but he'll just say, oh yeah, I come from the village over there, or I come from my mom, So that's where the Prasangika, as far as ordinary appearances go, they don't make any kind of assertion whatsoever. And so these are called the Prasangikas following consensus, or following ordinary consensus. Jitin Jagde Chebe Umapa. When we say Svatantrika and Prasangika, first of all, we should recognize that these are actually Tibetan ways of defining these positions that you have in traditions that originate in India. But there weren't actually people in India that said, I'm a Svatantrika or Prasangika. There were people in India who held particular positions, and the Tibetans then classified them. And the Svatantrika means then, like I said before, in terms of explaining things, they make logical assertions and so forth. So it's sort of more consumer friendly. The Prasangika are those who just expose absurd consequences. So Jamgon Kongtrul, he then, in the Treasury of Knowledge, Shijutsu, he says, appearances exist relatively. They're like illusions. In genuine actuality, nothing exists. It is like space. This is the position of the autonomy school, meaning the Svatantrika. And apparent reality is whatever mind imagines. It is asserted following worldly tradition. Genuine reality is beyond fabrications, inexpressible and inconceivable. This is the consequent school's tradition. Again, for the Prasangika, the consequent school, there's often the quote of the Buddha where he says, whatever worldly people says, I agree with them. And we will have that also for ourselves. When we walk into a situation and we know people hold a particular view, then it's no point arguing that's true for them. So, we just end up falling into extremes, taking another position. So the consequent school is, in a way, the intelligent way. It's also the easier way. But if you want to begin to understand the nature of your perceptions and so on, that's where the autonomy school, and in extension also the relative understanding of the relative view, as per, for example, the Sotrantika or Yogacharya, can be very helpful. So. Not well. We say once you have this, then you have that. Yeah, is that the Prasangika view? That's common for all of the Madhyamika, really. It's not this, it's not that, and we particularly put it in the negative, in the sense that say that once you have the notion of this, then you're going to have the notion of that. So that's on the ontological perspective, in terms of objective reality. In terms of the subjective experience, or the more epistemological aspect, then it is the observer that then begins to project onto the other. And that's where we have the subject-object. So that's more the scope of the third turning of the wheel, or the perspective of the third turning of the wheel. I hope this is making sense. And this is really just summing up what you have in Andy Carr's book. So, refer to that. I'd like to say he does an extraordinary good job of presenting in a very accessible way things that are sometimes a little bit forbidding when they're presented in the more traditional sense. So this is a very good stepping stone, really, to accessing a tremendous wealth of insight in the classical presentations. Okay. So for the next time, then we didn't get to do the chapter on the great reasonings, but please read that for the next time. And No Arising, Further Reasonings, and the analysis of the automobile, which is a very ancient Indian way of analyzing lack of inherent existence, as traditionally known as Chandrakirti's analysis of the cart. Anyway, we'll look at that next time. The person that you're seeing here is Nagarjuna. By this positive action may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom.